The rain had come suddenly, drenching the streets in a silvery sheet that blurred neon lights and muffled the hurried footsteps of pedestrians. At the corner of Braddock and 17th, beneath the inadequate shelter of a rusted awning, Claire Whitmore checked her watch and exhaled sharply. The time read 8:42 p.m. He was late. She had never been one for clandestine meetings, yet here she was, scanning the rain-slicked street for a man she had never met in person. The message had been clear. Urgent. Meet me at Braddock and 17th. 8:30 p.m. No delays. The urgency had been enough to pull her out of her apartment and into the downpour, but now doubt clawed at her thoughts. Had she misread the message? Or worse, was she being watched? A figure emerged from the rain, moving with the kind of deliberation that set Claire on edge. His trench coat was soaked, his hands buried in his pockets as he approached. He was taller than she expected, with dark eyes that assessed her in a single sweeping glance. Claire Whitmore. She hesitated. You're late. He smirked, but there was no humor in it. Traffic. His answer was clipped, as if he had been weighing how much information to provide. Claire folded her arms. You didn't include a name in your message. Didn't have time. We need to move. He nodded toward a narrow alley between two shuttered storefronts. It's not safe here. Claire hesitated. Who are you? A friend. For now, that's all that matters. She had every reason to walk away. But then again, she had every reason to be here in the first place. A week ago, she had received a file, an unmarked envelope slipped under her office door at the Tribune. Inside had been pages of confidential reports, implicating people she had only suspected were involved in something larger, something dangerous. The kind of information that didn't get leaked without consequence. The kind of information people killed for. Her job as an investigative journalist had led her into dangerous territory before, but this was different. This wasn't just a corporate scandal or political intrigue. This was something deeper, more insidious. Claire glanced around. The rain provided cover, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Fine, she said finally. Lead the way. The man turned without another word, and Claire followed him into the alley. The air smelled of damp concrete and stale cigarette smoke. Water dripped from rusted fire escapes, forming dark puddles that reflected the flickering glow of a failing street lamp. They walked in silence until they reached a side entrance to what appeared to be an abandoned building. The man produced a key and unlocked the door. Inside, the space was sparse, bare walls, a wooden table covered in files, and a single overhead light that cast long shadows. He locked the door behind them before pulling off his wet coat. Start talking, Claire demanded. What is this about? He studied her for a moment before responding. I was told you're the only one who can be trusted with this. He gestured to the table. Everything you saw in that file you received? It's just the surface. Someone wants you to dig deeper. Claire narrowed her eyes. And you? I'm just the messenger. She stepped forward, picking up one of the folders. Inside were more documents, surveillance photos, coded transactions, classified reports stamped with government insignia. Her pulse quickened. This was bigger than she had thought. The man leaned against the table. There's a reason you were chosen, Whitmore. Someone out there believes you're the only one who won't look away. Claire met his gaze, determination setting in. Then they were right. A sharp knock at the door shattered the moment. The man's expression darkened. We don't have much time. Claire swallowed. Whatever she had just stepped into, there was no turning back now. Here's the opening section with a strong narrative drive and a clear sense of intrigue. Let me know if you want any refinements. The air between them crackled, thick with words left unsaid and emotions barely restrained. Elise sat on the edge of the couch, her fingers curled around the stem of a half-empty wine glass. Across from her, Nathan leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed, his expression a careful mask. Outside, the city hummed with life, but inside, the apartment was a vacuum, pulling them into a space where everything they had resisted now seemed inevitable. You should go, Elise said, her voice steadier than she felt. Nathan exhaled slowly. I should. Neither of them moved. It had started innocently enough, late nights at the firm, working through depositions, sharing coffee that turned into whiskey, exchanging ideas that grew into personal confessions. Elise had told herself that her engagement to Daniel was reason enough to maintain distance, but reason had never been the strongest force between her and Nathan. It was the way he looked at her when she spoke, as if she were the only thing worth listening to in a room full of voices. The way he understood her ambition, her restlessness. Daniel was safe, reliable. Nathan was neither. Elise. Nathan's voice was low, careful, like he was testing the weight of her name in his mouth. If you tell me to leave, I will. She closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling deeply. She should say it. She should tell him to go, to walk away before they crossed a line that couldn't be redrawn. But her silence was an answer in itself. Nathan took a slow step forward. The space between them, already thin, disappeared. Her pulse quickened as he reached out, tracing a tentative line down her arm with his fingertips. Fire, bright and insistent, flared in its wake. This isn't fair, she murmured, but she didn't pull away. No, it isn't, he agreed, his voice rough. But it's real. And you know it. A part of her wanted to argue, to remind him of all the reasons this was a mistake. Instead, she looked up at him, and what she saw in his eyes shattered the last of her resolve. Need, raw and unspoken. The same need she had spent months pretending didn't exist within her. Her breath hitched as he cupped her face, his thumb brushing the corner of her lips. A shiver coursed through her, equal parts anticipation and fear. This was a moment of decision, a moment that would alter everything, and they both knew it. Elise. Nathan's voice was barely a whisper. Tell me to stop. But she couldn't. Because stopping meant losing something she wasn't ready to let go of. Because stopping meant walking back into a life that suddenly felt too small, too quiet. She leaned in, her lips just a breath away from his. And then, her phone buzzed on the table beside them, the screen lighting up with Daniel's name. A stark reminder of everything that was at stake. Elise pulled back as if burned, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. Nathan's jaw tensed, and for a moment, the weight of disappointment in his eyes made her chest ache. She turned away, gripping the edge of the couch as if it could anchor her. I can't. Nathan didn't move for a long moment. Then, with a slow nod, he stepped back. I understand. He walked to the door, pausing with his hand on the handle. But don't pretend this isn't real, Elise. Not with me. And then he was gone, leaving behind the lingering scent of him, the ghost of his touch, and the undeniable truth that, for the first time, she wasn't sure what she wanted anymore. I've crafted a compelling and emotionally charged scene that builds tension and leaves the reader eager to see what happens next. Let me know if you'd like any refinements. The town of Braceford lay in ruins. Smoke curled from the hollowed shells of buildings, embers glowing like dying stars beneath the overcast sky. Silence pressed heavily over the devastation, broken only by the occasional groan of wood collapsing into smoldering ash. Those who had survived stood in scattered clusters, eyes hollow, lips pressed into grim lines. They were not the same people who had welcomed the dawn only a day before. Among the survivors stood Elias Vance, his coat smeared with soot, his right arm bound tightly with a makeshift bandage. The deep gash beneath it throbbed, but he ignored the pain. There were more pressing concerns. His gaze swept the remains of the town square, searching for familiar faces. It was then that he saw her, Clara Hewitt, kneeling beside a broken cart, her hands trembling as she reached for a child's discarded shoe. Elias approached cautiously. Clara. She flinched at the sound of his voice but did not rise. She was here. Just yesterday. Her voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. Running through the square, laughing. Elias crouched beside her, his own voice thick with unspoken grief. We will find her. We will find all of them. He wasn't sure if he believed his own words. A sharp cry cut through the somber quiet. A young man staggered into the square, his face streaked with blood, his tunic torn. It was Isaac Marner, the apprentice blacksmith. He collapsed onto his knees, chest heaving. They're regrouping. The raiders, they didn't leave. They're just outside the valley. A ripple of fear passed through those gathered. The attack had been swift, brutal, merciless. Houses had burned, families scattered. The town's defenders had fought, but they had been outnumbered, outmatched. And now, the threat lingered. Elias rose to his feet. Then we have little time. He turned to the small assembly. We must decide, do we flee or do we stand? Murmurs broke out. Some were too weak to fight, too drained by loss and despair. Others, faces streaked with soot and fury, showed the hard glint of vengeance in their eyes. We have no weapons, a voice argued. No soldiers. We have our hands, our tools, another countered. And our will. Clara stood, brushing dirt from her skirts. Her eyes, red-rimmed but determined, met Elias's. If we leave, we lose everything. Again. And there will be nothing left to return to. Elias nodded. Then we prepare. The decision had been made. Not all would fight, but those who could, would. The next hours passed in a blur, barricades assembled from shattered furniture, crude weapons fashioned from farm tools, hidden caches of food gathered. The children and elderly were ushered toward the old cellar beneath the chapel, the most defensible place in town. Every able-bodied survivor took their place. As night fell, the valley grew eerily silent. Elias stood at the town's edge, gripping a rusted sword that had once belonged to his father. His knuckles turned white around the hilt. He did not know if they would survive the night, but he knew one thing for certain. They would not die cowering. I've crafted a compelling section that introduces the main characters and central conflict while maintaining a clear and engaging narrative. Let me know if you'd like any refinements.